I asked the boy I'd loved for 2 years to be my prom date in front of 300 people in our school cafeteria. He said yes. Then he turned to his friends in the back of the room, and I watched him mouth the words, "Told you she'd do it." 4 years later, that same boy was the one standing outside my apartment at 11 at night, asking if there was any chance left for us. Before I get into this one, if you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe to Hidden Karma Stories. You really don't want to miss where this one ends up. And do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from tonight. I genuinely read every single one, so don't be shy about saying hi. So here's how this whole thing started. I'm Taylor, and I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac with my mom, my dad, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, who used to sit in the front window every afternoon waiting for the school bus. I spent most of my junior and senior year of high school quietly, hopelessly in love with a guy named Brody Lawson. We'd been in the same friend group since freshman year. Ever since our biology teacher paired us up for a frog dissection, none of us actually wanted to do. Brody had this gift, even back then, for making whoever he was talking to feel like the only person in the room. He remembered things other guys his age never bothered to. He remembered that my dog had a vet appointment on a random Tuesday. He remembered that I'd mentioned liking some obscure song once, months earlier, in passing, and then I'd get in his car and it would already be playing, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to show me he'd been listening. Sophomore year, he gave me his jacket at a football game without me even asking, just draped it over my shoulders mid-conversation like it was nothing. Junior year, he drove me home from a friend's house in a thunderstorm because my own ride had bilayed, and we sat in his car outside my house for 45 minutes after he parked, just talking, the rain hammering the windshield, both of us in no hurry to end it. I told myself that kind of attention had to mean something. I was 16, then 17, and I wanted it to mean something so badly that I stopped letting myself question it. My two closest friends at the time, Jasmine and a girl named Priya, used to tease me about it constantly. Jasmine would catch me staring at him across the cafeteria and just shake her head and say, "You have got to tell him, Taylor, before I lose my mind watching this." I always laughed it off. I told her I was waiting for the right moment. By the spring of senior year, Brody was texting me almost every single night, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, conversations about nothing and everything, music, our families, what we wanted our lives to look like after high school. Nothing official ever got said out loud, but it felt like more than friendship to me, every single time. So when promposals became the entire school's obsession that March, every hallway plastered with posters and balloon arches, I made up my mind. I was done waiting around for him to make the first move. If he felt even half of what I felt, I told myself, this would be the easiest yes of his life. I spent almost 2 weeks planning it with Jasmine's help. We bought a roll of poster board from the craft store off Tunnel Road and stayed up 2 nights in a row cutting out letters. I wrote an inside joke from sophomore year across the top, something about the world's worst frog dissection partner, and underneath it in big block letters, "Will you go to prom with me?" Jasmine helped me string up a small cluster of balloons to carry into the cafeteria, and she promised to film it on her phone so I'd have it forever. The morning I planned to do it, I barely touched my breakfast. My hands were shaking so badly in the car that my mom asked twice if I was getting sick. I told her I was fine. I told myself I was fine the entire walk from the parking lot to the cafeteria doors, repeating it under my breath like a prayer. I found Brody at his usual table, surrounded by the same group of guys he always sat with, Casey and Drew and a couple of others. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I walked up, balloons in one hand, poster in the other, and unrolled it in front of him. The whole cafeteria went quiet for a second, then erupted into the kind of cheering that happens whenever somebody does something brave and public in a high school lunchroom. Brody stood up, grinning that grin I'd fallen for 2 years earlier, and said of course he'd say yes, he'd actually been hoping I'd be the one to ask. He hugged me right there in front of everyone, and for about 10 seconds it was the single best moment of my entire high school life. I remember thinking, this is it, this is the moment everything finally makes sense. Then I heard it. Behind him, Casey already had his phone up filming, and Drew was doubled over laughing so hard he had to grab the edge of the table to keep from falling off the bench. Brody turned around to face them, still grinning, and that's when he said it, loud enough for everyone close to us to hear clearly. He told them he knew I'd actually go through with it, that he'd called it weeks ago. It turned out the whole thing, my entire proposal, had been the punchline of a bet he and his friends made over winter break, wagering on whether they could get me to publicly confess in front of the whole school, just to see if I actually would. I had no idea any of it existed until that exact second, standing there with a deflating balloon string still wrapped around my wrist. I don't remember walking out of that cafeteria. I remember locking myself in a bathroom stall for the rest of the lunch period, knees pulled up to my chest, trying to breathe through the kind of crying that makes your whole body shake. I remember the office calling my mom because a teacher found me still in there 20 minutes after the bell rang, and I remember her face when she picked me up, somewhere between furious and heartbroken, not even fully understanding yet what had happened. Casey's video made its way around the entire senior class within 2 days. By Thursday, kids I hadn't talked to since middle school were stopping me in the hallway, asking with fake concern if I was okay, clearly just wanting a front row seat to my reaction. A junior I didn't even know played the clip out loud in the back of my AP literature class, not realizing, or maybe not caring, that I was sitting 4 rows away. I spent the final 2 months of senior year actively rerouting my walk to class just to avoid certain hallways. I skipped prom entirely. I told my mom I had a stomach bug. She didn't believe me, but she let me stay home anyway and brought me soup I didn't eat. That whole summer, I barely left my room. My mom tried everything. She signed me up for a pottery class I never went to. She suggested a part-time job at the bookstore downtown that I quit after 2 shifts because a classmate came in and recognized me. The only decision I made that entire summer that I'm still proud of is the one where I sat down with my laptop in late June and started researching colleges as far from North Carolina as my GPA and my parents' budget would reasonably allow. I ended up at a university in Nashville, Tennessee, 4 states and roughly 7 hours away from everyone who had ever watched that video. I decided somewhere on the drive out there, sitting in the back seat of my dad's car surrounded by boxes, that I was going to become a completely different person, someone Brody Lawson never got the chance to meet. I joined a campus volunteer organization called Bridge Builders during the first week of orientation, mostly because the booth was right next to the dining hall, and a girl running it smiled at me first. I started running every morning before my 8 a.m. class, just 2 miles at first, then 4, then I started lifting weights 3 times a week with a girl from my dorm. I cut my hair into a shorter style I never would have had the nerve to try back home, started dressing in a way that made me feel like I took up space instead of trying to disappear into it. My roommate's sophomore year, a girl named Brianna from Memphis, became the kind of friend who could read my mood from across a room. By the start of my junior year, I had a tight group of people who actually knew me, a GPA I was proud of, a body I felt strong in, and a sense of confidence that didn't depend on anyone else noticing me first. I dated a couple of guys casually, nothing serious, mostly just to prove to myself that I was capable of being wanted without it being a joke. I barely thought about Asheville at all anymore. Some weeks I didn't think about it once. That's when Brody showed up on my campus. I found out later he'd spent 2 semesters at a school in Georgia before flunking out, got rejected from his second-choice transfer, and ended up at the same university I'd spent 2 years quietly rebuilding myself in. I saw him for the first time at the campus bookstore during the first week of fall semester, standing in line ahead of me with a stack of textbooks under one arm. He turned around, did an actual double take, and it took him a few full seconds to connect the person standing in front of him with the girl he remembered from high school. He said I looked completely different, said running into me here of all places felt like some kind of sign. He acted like we were old friends bumping into each other after a long time apart, like that cafeteria had never happened, like I hadn't spent an entire summer hiding in my room because of him. I gave him a tight, polite smile, told him it was nice seeing him, and got out of line before he could ask for my number. Over the next several weeks, Brody found ways to keep turning up. He joined Bridge Builders, despite never once expressing an interest in community service back in high school. He started sitting 2 tables over from me at the library, always during the exact hours I usually studied between classes. He somehow got my number from an old mutual friend who handed it over without thinking to ask me first, and he started texting like nothing had ever gone wrong between us. Casual good mornings, questions about a class we apparently shared, links to memes he thought I'd find funny. I answered late, kept my replies short and pleasant, and never once gave him anything real to hold on to. Brianna started keeping what she called the Brody tracker. a running tally on a sticky note on our fridge of every single place he managed to show up. Monday, he was already in line at the campus coffee shop when I walked in for my usual afternoon latte, and he insisted on paying for mine before I could even open my wallet. Tuesday, he showed up 15 minutes late to Bridge Builders and took the one open chair directly across the table from me. Wednesday, he was on a treadmill at the gym, not even running, just walking slowly with his eyes fixed on the mirror that happened to face the squat rack where I was working out. Thursday, I picked up an extra shift at my work-study job in the campus library's front desk, and somehow Brody came in to study, sitting at the closest table to the desk for 3 straight hours without opening a single book. That weekend, a text came through from a number I didn't recognize. It was him, saying he'd gotten my number from an old friend and hoped that was okay, that he'd been thinking it would be good to catch up properly now that we were at the same school. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I stared at that message for almost 2 hours before responding. Part of me wanted to delete it and move on with my night. Another part of me, the part I'm less proud of, wanted to know if he would actually say anything real about what happened, if 4 years had changed anything about him at all. Eventually I typed back one word: sure. We met that following Tuesday afternoon at a cafe near the south edge of campus, the kind of place with mismatched mugs and a chalkboard menu. He'd already ordered for both of us by the time I walked in, remembered without asking that I used to get caramel macchiatos. He talked for most of the first 20 minutes about his new apartment off campus, his classes, how different college felt than he'd expected it to be. He complimented my haircut twice. He brought up an upcoming football tailgate the following Saturday and suggested, very casually, that we should go together. I kept my answers short, told him my classes were going fine, thanked him for the compliments without elaborating, and declined the tailgate by saying I already had plans. After almost a full hour of careful, harmless small talk, he leaned forward across the table, and his whole expression shifted into something more serious. He said he'd thought about me a lot since running into me again on campus. He admitted he sometimes wondered what might have happened if we'd actually stayed close after graduation instead of losing touch. He asked if we could start hanging out more now, maybe make up for the years we'd missed. I smiled, told him that sounded nice, gave him absolutely nothing solid to work with, glanced at my phone, and told him I needed to get to class. When I got back to our apartment, Brianna already had 2 mugs of tea steeping on the counter, like she'd known exactly when I'd be walking through the door. I told her everything, how Brody had spent an entire hour pretending the past simply didn't exist while quietly fishing to see if I still had any feelings buried under all that politeness. She asked what I planned to do about it. Sitting there on our second-hand couch, I realized out loud, almost surprising myself, that I didn't actually need to do anything except keep living my life exactly the way I already was. The fact that he couldn't even bring himself to say the actual word, sorry, told me absolutely everything I needed to know. The texts kept coming after that almost daily. A meme about a professor we apparently both had, an invite to a concert happening at a venue downtown, a question about a homework assignment for a class I wasn't even sure he was enrolled in. I answered maybe 1 out of every 5, always hours later, always pleasant, never warm enough to mistake for interest. He kept showing up everywhere: library, coffee shop, bridge builders meetings, the gym at 6 in the morning. I never gave him a single opening. At a house party a couple weeks later, hosted by a girl in my sociology class, one of Brody's old friends from Asheville found me standing alone in the kitchen refilling my cup. His name was Marcus, and he'd been one of the guys in the back of that cafeteria the day of the promposal, laughing along with everyone else. My stomach tightened the second I recognized him, but I kept my face neutral. He asked if we could talk for a minute, and once we found a quieter corner near the back door, he apologized. He said he'd been an immature coward back in high school, that he was genuinely sorry for laughing at something that cruel and never once checking on me afterward. I told him I appreciated it, that I'd moved past it. He seemed visibly relieved, and we ended up talking for almost 20 minutes about how much we'd both changed since graduation. Before he wandered off to find his friends, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Brody talked about me constantly these days, genuinely confused about why I wouldn't give him a real shot, like he couldn't fully grasp that what he did all those years ago might have actual, lasting consequences. Around that same stretch of the semester, I started seeing someone new. His name was Caleb Whitfield, a guy from my statistics study group who was steady and funny in a way that never felt like a performance. He never played games, never made me question where I stood with him. The first time we got coffee together, just the two of us, he asked thoughtful questions about my major and actually listened to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk. When he eventually asked gently if there was history between me and the guy who kept showing up everywhere we went, I told him the whole story, the bet, the video, the entire humiliating summer that followed. Caleb listened without interrupting once, and when I finished, he simply said I deserved a whole lot better than someone who would do that to anyone, let alone someone they claimed to care about. He said he wasn't worried because he could tell plainly that I wasn't interested in Brody at all. Brody noticed Caleb fast. I saw it happen in real time one afternoon when the two of us crossed paths with him on the quad, laughing together about something Caleb had said. Brody's smile faltered for half a second before he caught himself and forced it back into place. A few days later, he texted asking, point blank this time, if Caleb and I were officially dating. I told him we were seeing each other. I watched the 3 little dots on my screen appear and disappear 4 separate times before his reply finally landed, saying that was cool, that he hoped I was happy. I could picture him sitting there staring at his phone, working through that information with visible discomfort, realizing for the first time that he wasn't the only option left on the table. About a week after that, he invited me to a small gathering at his new apartment, mentioning that Hannah, a classmate I'd recently reconnected with over coffee and genuinely liked, would be coming too. I almost said no automatically, but Hannah's name changed my mind. Friday evening, I showed up around 8 to find his apartment small but clean. Mismatched furniture that looked thrifted, maybe 15 people scattered between the living room and the kitchen. Brody opened the door, and his whole face lit up the second he saw me. He touched my arm lightly as I walked past him into the apartment, and I slid out of reach smoothly, heading straight for Hannah by the kitchen counter. For the next 20 minutes, every time there was a lull in our conversation, Brody would hover nearby, trying to redirect us toward the couch where there was more room, more chances to include himself. Every single time, I turned back to Hannah and asked her another question. Later, Hannah pulled me out onto the cramped little balcony off the living room, just big enough for 2 people, and a rusted railing overlooking the parking lot. She asked carefully if it bothered me being around him now, being back in his apartment after everything. I told her honestly that I wasn't the same girl who cried in her car after that cafeteria stunt anymore, that I'd built a whole new life here, and that he simply didn't have any power over me. She studied my face for a long moment, like she was checking whether I actually believed what I'd just said, and then relaxed like she'd decided I did. When we came back inside, Brody asked if he could talk to me privately for a minute, and we ended up back out on that same balcony, the door sliding shut behind him, muffling the music from inside. He leaned against the railing and ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I remembered from high school. He said he knew that day in the cafeteria had been completely messed up, that everyone involved had been immature and stupid, and that he wished we could move past it now that we were older. He never once said the actual word sorry. He framed the entire thing like some mutual unfortunate event that had simply happened to both of us, instead of something he had personally planned and carried out. I told him calmly that I'd already moved past it, that I wasn't angry anymore, careful not to give him anything more than that. Relief flooded across his face, and he stepped forward like he might hug me. I took a smooth step back instead and suggested we head inside to rejoin everyone. 2 weeks later, bridge builders organized an overnight retreat at a state park a few hours outside the city, complete with hiking trails and a designated fire pit area for the group. Brody tried to partner with me on absolutely everything, setting up tents side by side, hiking close behind me on the trail to the waterfall, sitting directly across from me at the campfire that night where he could keep steady eye contact across the flames. Caleb came on the trip too, and I made sure to walk beside him on the wider parts of the trail, laughing at his stories, very visibly enjoying his company. I caught Brody watching us more than once from a few people back. That night around the fire, somebody suggested a round of truth or dare, and when it landed on Brody, he picked truth. Someone asked if he had a crush on anyone there at the campsite. The whole energy around the fire shifted instantly. He looked straight at me and said yes, he liked someone, but he wasn't sure she felt the same way back. Every head at that fire turned toward me at once. I kept my expression completely blank and took a slow sip from my mug of hot chocolate, refusing to give the moment anything to feed on. A little while later, I walked over to the coolers near the parked cars to refill my water, away from the firelight. The night was cold and clear, stars scattered overhead through gaps in the pine trees. I heard footsteps behind me, and then Brody's voice, quiet, saying my name. He stepped closer, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, and told me he'd genuinely fallen for who I'd become, and asked if I'd give him a real chance, a real date, to see if there was something actually worth building between us now. I told him I needed time to think, closed the cooler and walked back to the fire alone, leaving him standing there in the dark. For most of the following week, I barely answered his texts at all. One night, out of a curiosity I'm not particularly proud of, I went digging through old social media and found his page from the school in Georgia. There were months of photos with a girlfriend, her arm looped around him in nearly every shot, comments full of inside jokes and pet names. Then, abruptly, the posts stopped for a few weeks. After that came a string of posts from her about being tired of feeling unappreciated, about knowing your own worth and refusing to settle for people who take you for granted. The timeline lined up almost exactly with when he'd flunked out of that school. It made me wonder, sitting alone in my room with my laptop glowing in the dark, whether not valuing people until the exact moment he'd already lost them was a pattern that ran a lot deeper than just what happened to me. At another party a few weeks after that, I finally told him directly, flat out, that I didn't think dating him was a good idea given our entire history. His face fell, and he asked, almost wounded, if I was ever going to actually forgive him, if he'd ever stop paying for one night in high school. I corrected him gently, told him that I had forgiven him, but that forgiveness was never the same thing as forgetting, or pretending what happened didn't matter at all. Something shifted in his expression right then, like he was genuinely hearing me for the first time instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He asked if there was anything at all he could do to prove he'd actually changed. I told him it wasn't about proving anything to me. I told him I'd built a life here that I was genuinely proud of, and I wasn't interested in bringing someone into it who reminded me of its absolute worst moment. He nodded slowly, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him look, even in high school, and walked away without his usual confident swagger. For weeks after that, my phone stayed almost completely quiet. No good morning texts, no memes, no random check-ins about classes. Brianna asked one evening out of nowhere if something had happened with Brody, since she hadn't seen him lingering around our usual spots lately. I told her about the conversation at the party, how I'd finally been honest about not wanting to date him at all. She said she was proud of me for being honest instead of stringing him along just because I technically could have. Caleb and I got more serious during that stretch, actual planned dinner dates instead of just casual study sessions between classes, conversations about spring break, about where we both wanted to end up after graduation. I ran into Brody at the library a few days later, picking up a book I'd put on hold, and something about him felt different right away, no performance in it, no calculated charm. He asked how I'd been, and his voice sounded almost normal, like he was actually asking instead of angling towards something. I told him I'd been good, busy with classes. He nodded and told me he'd been thinking a lot about what I said at that last party, about not wanting someone in my life who reminded me of its worst moment. He said there was more he wanted to tell me if I had a minute, and I glanced at my phone, saw I had time before my next class, and sat down across from him. He told me he'd been seeing a therapist since the previous semester, after his grades had gotten serious enough to put him on academic probation again. He said they'd been working through a pattern he had, taking people for granted until the exact moment they were already gone. He told me quietly about the girlfriend in Georgia, how she'd tried to talk to him for months about problems in their relationship, and he'd brushed her off every single time because he assumed she'd always just be there. Then she left, right before he flunked out, and he lost everything at once. He said his therapist helped him see he did the same thing with friendships too, with his family, always assuming people would stick around no matter how he treated them. I told him I appreciated him being honest instead of making excuses, and that I needed space, real space, not friendship, at least for now. He said he understood completely, and that he wouldn't push or keep showing up everywhere I went anymore. The weeks that followed felt lighter in a way I didn't fully notice until Brianna pointed it out one Friday night while we were getting ready to go out. She said I seemed different lately, like I'd finally set down something heavy I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. I thought about it and realized she was right. I'd stopped scanning rooms before walking into them. I'd stopped planning what I'd say if he approached me. He'd become background noise instead of the main event running underneath every part of my day. Hannah told me around that time that Brody's academic advisor had finally given him a serious, formal warning about his GPA, and that he'd actually started showing up to every single class after that, doing the readings, asking real questions during office hours instead of pretending he already understood everything. She said he seemed different when she'd run into him around the student centre lately, less cocky, more willing to admit out loud when he was confused about something. At Bridge Builders' spring presentation night, held in one of the smaller event spaces on campus with folding chairs and a borrowed projector, Brody stood up to present research he'd put together on affordable student housing initiatives. I'll admit I expected something half-finished. Instead, he delivered a genuinely thoughtful presentation, real data, real case studies from 3 different college towns, practical suggestions our own campus committee could actually use. People asked follow-up questions afterward, and he answered every single one with a kind of quiet confidence that didn't feel like he was performing for anyone. Afterward, I walked over while he was packing up his laptop and told him honestly that his presentation had been really good, that I could tell how much work he'd put into it. He looked up, and the smile he gave back was different from any smile I'd seen on his face before, like the compliment alone was enough, without needing it to be an opening toward something more. He thanked me and said the project had actually gotten him thinking seriously about urban planning as a career. Marcus found me in the campus dining hall the following week and mentioned, between bites of his lunch, that Brody had been a noticeably better friend lately too, more reliable, less self-centered, actually apologizing to a couple of people he'd ghosted back in high school without explanation. Marcus said he genuinely believed getting turned down by me had been the wake-up call Brody had needed, and that the rest of their old friend group had started being more honest with each other too, calling out bad behavior instead of just laughing it off the way they used to. Months passed quickly after that, the way semesters do once you stop counting every single day. Brody started dating a transfer student named Olivia, and I'd see them around campus occasionally, holding hands on the way to class, sitting close together at the dining hall. At a spring festival on the quad that April, food trucks and live music set up across the lawn, Olivia introduced herself to me out of nowhere, while I was waiting in line for lemonade, sweet and friendly, clearly aware of some history between Brody and me, without ever asking a single direct question about it. We talked for a few minutes about classes we apparently shared and a club she was thinking about joining, and I told her honestly that she should come check it out. When she walked back toward where Brody was waiting by a food truck, I felt completely, genuinely neutral about the entire interaction. I hoped things went well for her. I meant it. At a party that fall of my senior year, hosted at someone's place off campus, a guy I barely knew started telling a vague version of the cafeteria story to a group near the kitchen, framing it as some funny high school bet without knowing exactly whose story it actually was. My stomach dropped for a second, bracing for the familiar wave of humiliation. But before I could decide what to do about it, Brody spoke up from across the room, unprompted. He said it was the worst thing he'd ever done to someone, and that he'd spent years afterward trying to become someone better because of it. He never said my name, he never made a single excuse. The room went quiet for a beat, then someone changed the subject, the way conversations at parties always eventually do. Later, I found him out on the back porch getting some air and thanked him for what he'd said. He told me he meant every word of it, that he wasn't sorry it hadn't worked out between us romantically. He was sorry, fully and simply, for hurting me in the first place. I told him I appreciated the apology, that I could genuinely see how much he'd changed since high school. We probably wouldn't ever be close friends, I told him, but I was glad he was growing into someone better. He asked if I was happy. I told him yes, I really was. He smiled and said, "Good. That's what matters," and we went back inside to rejoin our separate groups of friends, easy, no tension left between us at all. That spring, walking back from dinner one evening, Caleb suddenly stopped on the sidewalk and turned to face me, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He told me he loved me, that he wanted a real future together, and then he got down on one knee right there on the path and asked me to marry him. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, no hesitation at all, because being with him had felt right in a way nothing else ever had. Graduation day arrived warm and bright, the kind of weather that makes every photo look good. After the ceremony ended, surrounded by families taking pictures on the lawn, I spotted Brody across the crowd with Olivia and his parents, all of them smiling, taking turns with the camera. He caught my eye and waved, easy and genuine, and I waved back the same way. No lingering tension, no unfinished business sitting between us anymore. Later, as everyone started drifting toward the parking lots, he found me and Caleb near the edge of the lawn and told me he was moving to Seattle for a job, leaving in 2 weeks, probably wouldn't be back this way again for a long time. He thanked me, his voice steady, completely without the old charm he used to hide behind, for teaching him that actions have real consequences that don't just undo themselves the moment you want them to. I told him I hoped he had a great life out there, and I meant every word of it, no bitterness left in me at all. He shook Caleb's hand and walked back toward Olivia, and that was the last real conversation Brody Lawson and I ever had. That night, Brianna and I sat on the front steps of our apartment building with iced coffee, watching neighbors load moving trucks up and down the street. She brought up Brody without me saying a word first, told me it was the first time she'd ever seen me really, fully stand up for myself and hold a boundary no matter how much pressure got thrown at it. She said watching me choose myself, over and over, instead of giving in to nostalgia or guilt or the easier path, had quietly changed how she handled her own relationships too. I think about that girl sometimes, the one locked in a bathroom stall the day of the promposal, certain her life was already over at 17. I wish I could go back and tell her she'd be okay, that she'd become someone steady and sure of herself, loved by someone who never once made her question her own worth from the very first day. The best revenge was never about making Brody suffer, or making him want me back, or forcing some big lesson on him. It was simply building a life so full and so good that what he did stopped having any power over me at all. So tell me down in the comments, were you Team Taylor staying cold the entire way through, or do you think she should have cut him off completely the moment he showed back up on her campus? I read every single comment, so don't hold back.